When we're talking about whether the model is economically consistent, one of the things that comes up is whether the patterns and are reasonable, whether they're something that we should expect, and whether the model itself is consistent with the industry dynamics that we should expect. So one of these is something we have to think deeply about. Are the patterns there because they should be there, or are they there because, again, of sort of mechanical expectations based on the forecasts? And then the next thing is sort of a way to check our work. Given what we have predicted, if we look at the way that the other firms in the industry change, does that make sense based on what we predicted here? Okay. So we want to, when we're talking about reasonable patterns, we want to make sure that we don't make some easy to make mistakes. So for instance, let's look at this calculation of return on invested capital. So again, just a really simple income statement, balance sheet, pull down. We got no plan and invested capital. We're using that to calculate ROIC. But what I want to show you is just how easy it is for relatively minor assumptions about forecasts to have relatively large impacts on our outcomes. Right? So here we got a firm. We got price, we got number of units, so we've got revenue, and then we've got cost and cost per unit. So we've got marginal cost and marginal revenue. That gives us profit. We've got invested capital given, so we can calculate ROIC. But let's take relatively minor change, and this is a really common thing you see a lot, right? So let's say, okay, we're going to say that we'd like to be able to increase prices with inflation. And inflation is about 3% a year. So we'd like to be able to charge about 3% per year more for our product, just based on inflation. That way we're not losing any money. That's totally reasonable. Lots of firms do it. They may not do it year over year, but maybe they do it every couple of years. They raise prices to adjust for inflation. Totally reasonable. And then the firm simultaneously is saying, you know what, absent any of that, we're not talking about revenue growth or anything like that. What we want to focus on as a firm is we want to reduce our costs. We want to focus on cost efficiency. So we're only forecasting price increases because of inflation, but what we're going to forecast and what this model is built and based around is a cost efficiency measure. So we're going to try and reduce our cost per unit. And so we're going to, focus on the supply chain. We're going to look at the manufacturing efficiency. We're going to look at, all of the costs associated with building a product, and we're going to try and cut these costs. And we think if we really, really focus on it, we can cut our costs by 2% a year for the next 5-10 years. Again, a totally reasonable goal for a company to have, a totally reasonable thing to try and forecast into your model. And maybe 2% a year is a little too big. I mean, it might last too long. Maybe it's 2% a year for 2 or 3 years or 4 years. But it's not unreasonable to say that you're going to be super aggressive and you're going to try and cut costs all the way down, right? But so we've made two completely, totally reasonable, relatively minor changes, but because of growth, exponential growth like this, you can see the impact it has, right? Look at year one. This is our normal year. In year one, the ROIC is 9.3%, right? So the firm has a pretty good return. That's pretty solid, right? But 10 years of 3% growth in prices and 2% reduction in costs, and our ROIC has jumped to 40%. Right? Now our revenue is almost double our costs, when before it was only like 10% bigger than our costs. Right? That is the impact of forecasting based on percentage growth rates. And it is not like, this isn't through any fault of our own. We made two reasonable assumptions, but those assumptions, the way they interlinked with each other, the way they worked against each other, means that our ultimate model doesn't have any economic rationale behind it. There's no reason to assume that in 10 years a firm quadruples its ROIC just through a cost-cutting measure. Right? And so we have to be really careful that changes in key inputs, particularly on the revenue and cost side, can have unintended consequences farther down the model. Okay. And the second part, the next part is, are the results plausible? And this is more of a check, right? We've analyzed our model. We've thought about economic consistency. We've thought about whether the patterns are intended. We've made sure that all our accounting rules are satisfied. then we can start to go externally to try and check whether our model is doing a good job. And the best way to check externally is to compare it to firms that are otherwise similar to the firm we're doing. Right? Again, I told you that really the best way to do it is just to do it side by side with a comparison firm like UPS and FedEx. But if we don't do that, at the very least, what we should be doing is checking our work against some common or comparable firms at the end of the model. So maybe I'm looking at a sort of a specialty retail store. I think this is a little bit wonky just because I find it difficult to find good comparison firms for some types of firms. But let's say we are analyzing PetSmart, right? We might try and compare it to other pet stores, but we might also recognize that a specialty retail store might be similar to other specialty retail stores, and we could compare it to those, right? I'm not sure that these are the best comparisons, but we can work with what we have right now. Right? What we would do here is we would look at our forecasts, and we would say, okay, we're forecasting an enterprise value of X. How does that compare to its comparison firms, to the other firms that are like it? And then we could use financial ratios and multiples. And a multiple is just a kind of ratio, a forward-looking ratio. And again, we normally would have a chapter on multiples. We're not going to have one because, of all this, we had to cut out some stuff. So a multiple is just a way for me to compare one firm to another. And I made mention of it a little bit in the last chapter, right? A revenue multiple or an EBITDA multiple, which would be like EBITDA to enterprise value. It would say my enterprise value is 10 times my revenue, and a comparable firm should have a similar ratio. So it should have an enterprise value that's 10 times its revenue. And if that's true, then that's one of the ways we can compare it. So if I get to the end of my analysis, I calculate enterprise value, I look at the enterprise value to EBITDA ratio, and I see that it's similar to my comparison firms, then I can say, okay, my results are plausible because they're at least giving me numbers that are in the right realm of what they should be, right? I'll never know if they're exactly right because exactly right doesn't have any meaning. We're predicting the future. But if they're in the right realm of everything else, then I'm making, at the very least, the same mistakes as everyone else in the market. And I should be okay with that. Now, once I've done my economic consistency and I've analyzed the model like that, it's time to turn to sort of some model checks. And maybe they're not checks so much as they're ways to assess how our assumptions impact the model. Okay, so a sensitivity analysis means to change one of our key input variables at a time and try to see how that changes the value that we calculate or we estimate at the end of the DCF process. So for instance, I've made a prediction that revenue is going to have a 3% growth rate for the next 10 years. What if revenue has only a 2% growth rate? How does that affect value? What if revenue has a 3% growth rate, but costs also grow in line with revenue? Costs grow at 1% because inflation makes everything more expensive. What if revenue grows at 3%, but because revenue grows, that impacts something else? Right? These kind of analysis can help us think about our assumptions more deeply, and they can help us make a better model. Right? So a sensitivity analysis is looking primarily at individual inputs. So we're going to be testing revenue, costs, what about tax changes, and we're doing them all one at a time. Right? So I'm only varying one input at a time, and I'm just varying the inputs that I have made assumptions about. Okay? And I'm seeing what the impact on valuation is going to be from that. So this can, from an investor's perspective, this can help guide us into the areas that a company can focus on to create value. Once we see what input the valuation is most sensitive to, then I can guide management into making decisions that are going to primarily affect that valuation. That means that input. Right? So if it's revenue, then we should be focusing on revenue. If it's cost, we should be focusing on cost. And we should be thinking about that. And then we'll go one step further with sensitivity analysis, and we'll start to think about trade-offs and if I change one variable, how that should change another. And then sensitivity analysis is sort of the final step where, or not sensitivity, scenario analysis is the final step where I start to think about different scenarios altogether, like different states of the world that might impact everything in the firm, all of our choices, and how we think about that. Okay, so sensitivity analysis is pretty easy given our hopefully our well-built Excel model. I just go back to my forecast and I say, what if my forecast for revenue is 1 percentage point lower? Then I go look at my valuation. I go look at my enterprise value. Okay, it went down. And then I can build another spreadsheet with all of these input changes noted and all of the output changes, all the results, how the results change noted. And that can give me a bigger picture view of what this model is actually telling us about the firm.